Hi, everyone. Welcome. We would like to get started, so please do find a seat. Welcome to our annual Kirk Lecture hosted by the Department of Religious Studies here at the University of Denver. We're really pleased to have you all here today. This is something that we do once a year. It's a really special thing, and I am very excited about our particular speaker and this talk, which I see as both timely and perhaps relevant, not only to the world situation, but everything that we are seeing here today. So I would like to introduce our TAK winner this year, which is really exciting. So can we all give her a round of applause? And this is Amelia Broderick-King, and she is a 4+1 student in the Religious Studies program. And I am very pleased to have her introduce our guest speaker tonight. So without further ado.
All right, welcome everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay, perfect. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for our annual Kirk Lecture. As Deepa said, my name is Amelia Broderick-King, and I am a 4+1 student in Religious Studies. Thank you very much. Thank you. So it is my pleasure and honor today to introduce our lecturer, Dr. Lucia Holsether. Our department launched the Kirk Lecture program in the 1990s, seeking to bring cutting-edge research in the field of religious studies to the DU community. It's an opportunity each year for students to meet acclaimed faculty and researchers from other institutions and organizations, as well as a chance to expand on the mission of community engagement that shapes our educational approach. As someone who is getting both their bachelor's and master's degrees in religious studies, I hear a lot of critique, that it is too niche a subject, that it won't teach enough real-life skills. And what I always say in return is, well, first of all, that's not true. But second of all, that it teaches me what I think is the most valuable skill, which is how to be a human. It teaches me how to read ancient texts and current pop culture. It encourages me to interrogate belief and traditions. It shows me how to understand politics and economy. The study of religion explains to me how we got to be the way we are and why, and where we go from here. I think there's no greater tool to learn than that of how to be a human. This is the education we get through religious studies, and this is what has informed Dr. Lucia Holsether's work. After getting her Bachelor of Arts from Agnes Scott College, her Master of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School, and her Master of Arts and PhD from Yale University, all in religious studies, Dr. Holsether is a prime example of the possibilities afforded to a graduate in this field. Today, Dr. Lucia Holsether is an associate professor of religious studies at Skidmore College and currently a visiting associate professor at Brown University. Her work revolves around capitalism and labor, histories of social movements, feminist theory, popular culture, and media, and other topics in contemporary cultural critique. Today's lecture will center how elites have absorbed critiques from the left into capitalism over the past 5 decades, framing racial equity initiatives, microloans, and fair trade consumption as ways the system can address its own harms. Dr. Holsether will discuss how these efforts sustain the belief that capitalism, when aligned with humanitarian goals, can repair the violence it has historically and continuously caused. We will together ponder the question, what happens when even modest reforms face backlash, not from the left, but from ethno-nationalists attacking woke capitalism? In reflecting on her book, Capitalist Humanitarianism, Dr. Holsether argues that today's right-wing movements are not a rupture from a neoliberal globalism, but another expression of its underlying logic. I encourage you all to listen to this lecture, keeping in mind the questions which Dr. Holsether addresses in her research, but I also hope you will think through the critical lens of religious studies and continue to contemplate how you can learn to be a human through understanding capitalist humanitarianism. So, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our 2026 Kirk lecturer, Dr. Lucia Holsether.
That was a brilliant articulation of religious studies. Thank you, Amelia. Okay, I have many people to thank. It's really a pleasure to be here. I know that these kinds of events are the work of many, many hands. So thank you, Deepa Sundaram, for the invitation and the coordination of this event, and for being the person who, more than really anyone else, has pushed me to come to better articulations of the stakes of this project for our current moment. Thank you to Dorian Weissman and Jen Bishop and Lynn Van Etten and Stephen Jackson for all of the logistical, media, and marketing work you did to make this happen. Thank you to the graduate students who responded so generously and brilliantly to my work yesterday. That is Andrew Rob Scott, Devin Whitaker, David Kemp, Kirsten Dahlquist, Ryan Howell, and Zane Johnston. All of you are going to amazing places and really reflections of why religious studies is a great field. And thank you all for being here. I know that there are always a million different pressures on our time and labor, and so it means a lot to me that you are here thinking with me about some of the questions that were just introduced. I want to think tonight about the life of critique and resistance in our current historical conjecture. One where ethno-nationalist and techno-fascist movements have not only occupied the highest positions of authority, but are not even bothering to hide their contempt for the democratic process. It could seem a little weird to begin there, since tonight I am coming to you as a scholar who, up to this point, has built a lot of her career critiquing what could seem like a nostalgic fever dream for a better kind of capitalism, a better time in our economy. The book I'm here to talk to you about today is about ethical capitalism, or what I refer to as capitalist humanitarianism. When I say capitalist humanitarianism, I am referring to a range of 20th and 21st century attempts to create a relatively more, quote, socially responsible, ethical, humanitarian system of monetized surplus value, property, and expropriation and wage labor. So we could probably spend the rest of this hour listing examples of projects like this, projects to pursue the proverbial double bottom line. Fair trade companies, microcredit banks, social responsibility offices and corporations, buy one, give one model sales like Tom's and Warby Parker, so-called ESG investing, accelerator programs for social entrepreneurs. We're in Denver, which feels like a kind of crunchy utopia of these kinds of projects. Every single one of these models has its own historical and political and social contingency. Capitalist humanitarianism isn't just a word for all of these projects individually, it's a word for the logic that I want to argue they have in common. And this is a logic, or really even a hope, an expectation, that free market capitalism can be a context for enacting feminist, anti-racist, anti-colonial solidarities with people who have been targeted by the same raced, gendered, colonial, neocolonial economic violence that free markets themselves inflict. I would argue that capitalist humanitarianism is the background noise of contemporary life in much of the global north, not an anomaly. And I would contend today that this is even true, and maybe even especially true, when its consensus seems to have come under attack from the right. At the outset of this project, which began as a dissertation, I was working from my vantage point as an organizer in various economic justice and abolitionist and immigrant rights campaigns. My question then was, how was it that elite corporate and financial entities had begun to absorb the sorts of vocabularies of social justice that were more common to left movements, at least in my experiences? Languages like diversity, equity, inclusion, even redistribution, even anti-colonialism. As I kept doing the project, my question shifted a little bit. How was it that people committed to radical programs of redistribution on the left began to imagine that they, or that we, could pursue some relative form of social democracy through lesser evil versions of conspicuous consumption, labor commodification, and debt capital? To me, It wasn't just that capitalist humanitarian projects put a happier face on systems of expropriation and uneven exposure to premature death that is structured into any late capitalist existence. It was that their effect was to manage and to assimilate the dissonance and the pain that comes from being a knowing beneficiary to this order of things. What I have been most interested in is how values, fantasies, and attachments of capitalist humanitarianism, and perhaps of fascism as well through it, are woven into the rhythms of ordinary life until they shape our imaginations so much that we struggle to notice or break from them. Okay, before I go any further, I do want to name very specifically a question that may still be on your mind, certainly it's on mine, which is, really, are we really going to be here tonight critiquing people who are apparently trying to make capitalism less overtly violent, when we are in pretty much in every single respect at an ethno-nationalist, neo-fascist inflection point in history? Yes, Denver is a crunchy dreamscape, and as you all know far better than I, it is also the same town that Palantir has for many years called its home base. Not anymore, thanks to y'all. Okay, those who are here locally, y'all are experts. You know that this project of Peter Thiel has logistically masterminded the occupation and campaign of ethnic cleansing and disappearance still being carried out not only in the Twin Cities, but all over the country and the world. You know that its current CEO, Alex Karp, has written a book that traffics in a Straussian clash of civilizations rhetoric that endorses an endless mass casualty war of the periphery on the grounds that the so-called West must be protected at all costs, and argues that this preservation of Western democracy requires anti-democratic means. These means include warehousing people in for-profit concentration camps, apparently. The reason you know all this is that you showed Palantir what actual democracy looks like when you kicked them out. I am really inspired by this. And still I keep returning to the question that I don't think we will ever fully answer, but we can get closer. How is a techno-fascist paramilitary surveillance firm going to make common home with all of these little offerings that we get as we wander the streets to a kinder, gentler, more inclusive global capitalism, a kind of capitalism that, in the words of many a CEO that I interviewed, builds bridges and not walls? Of course, the Palantir case is only one of many examples in a flooded zone. We are living through a massive contraction of social safety nets, campaigns to outlaw even the most shallow of DEI and environmental responsibility programs, the leveraging of domestic terrorism laws against anti-Zionist and anti-carceral organizers. I often feel that I am fighting to hold the line on liberal institutions that I have spent my life critiquing. Is the critique of capitalist humanitarianism really a priority right now? Am I sure that this won't do more harm than good? Am I sure that my critique won't be repurposed to take away even more? There is a lot of dissonance here, but this is when I turn to the lesson of anti-fascist thinkers throughout history, who have taught me that we should take the presence of this kind of dissonance and doubt not as an invitation to retreat, but as an invitation to keep pushing the envelope. We should not, in other words, assimilate the conflict and the cheap comforts of having chosen a lesser evil, but keep demanding more. Okay, I want to add a little caveat that I wrote earlier today, which is that I want to confess something to you, which is I have a little bit of regret about how I titled my talk, Socially Responsible Sweatshops, which you will learn where that comes from in a bit. On the one hand, I think it's a good title because it has a shock value to draw a crowd. What is a socially responsible sweatshop? On the other, I worry that it's kind of setting the stage for a self-confidence that I have not earned and I don't necessarily want to endorse about our own moral and political position, as difficult as that is. Socially responsible sweatshop is an anathema, of course. To hear it from me when I first heard it said in 2015 in an interview with an investor, I came out of that interaction both alarmed and relieved that I would never say such a thing. I know that sweatshops can never be socially responsible, duh. I felt superior. And when I think about that, when I think about the voice that I wrote this book in, which I'm going to read to you in a little bit, I think about what I tell my students all the time, which is no straw men, no easy opponents. The study of religion is a discipline where we study and engage with and try to understand viewpoints that may seem absolutely incommensurate with or even abhorrent to all sense, all history, and all material reality. And this pursuit of understanding requires holding off on the assumption that is really easy, I do it all the time, that we moderns, we liberals, we atheists, we good capitalists, we feminists, we Christians, we whatever, have a more universal or knowledgeable view than others. It requires that we hold curiosity and commitment to understanding with as much ferocity as we hold a commitment to freedom and democracy, and a knowledge that we can do those things at the same time. This is very, very hard. And to me, it names the urgency of religious studies as a field that we must protect because it is the field where this work is happening. In religious studies, we study the vast plurality of human experience and belief. We study how people withdraw from worlds that they have decided no longer serve them, even though they have inherited them and that everyone else is occupying them, and try to build new ones against every odd. We study the conversion of hearts and minds, how an idea or a system that we once saw as fully unconscionable, a socially responsible sweatshop perhaps, becomes the unlikely blueprint for living. The archive of capitalist humanitarianism, I would contend, this good capitalism that I think we would maybe be forgiven for wanting as an alternative for what is raining down on us right now, speaks to every single one of these themes that religious studies is poised to study. Right now, I think capitalist humanitarianism, its history, its anthropology is valuable as an archive of managed dissonance in a crisis. And I think paying attention to how it works can teach us something about resisting the cul-de-sacs of complacency that would disperse our demands for a radically better world. The base building work of fascism is not only in the terrifying neo-apocalypticism of Nazi rallies. It is arguably showing up in the lulling, unspectacular strategies by which late capitalist institutions administratively redirect radical analysis, critiques, and collective dissent so that they no longer threaten, so that they might even help to reproduce normative relationships of power and ownership. I learned this insight from the Frankfurt School theorist Walter Benjamin, who found words for capitalist desire-making under fascism. He, with many others in the Frankfurt School cohort, were asking, how is it that this enlightened society, Germany, which we thought was so progressive and so scientifically advanced, had capitulated to fascism? People there thought, like, not us, never here. And they said, no, this is a continuation. The masses have a right to change property relations, Walter Benjamin wrote. Fascism seeks to give them an expression while preserving property. Capitalist humanitarianism could be one of those forms of expression. The question that I seek to ask as a religious studies scholar is this: what forms, what structures of feeling, what palliatives intervene to manage crises like the one we are in when they are at their most intractable? I think paying attention to how capitalist humanitarianism works is urgent right now so that we can understand the structures that brought us to this conjecture in the first place. So this is where I want to go into a little bit of the history and share with you some about my book and highlight how the history of capitalist humanitarianism, those good crunchy Denver things, runs through the history of ethnic cleansing and settler dispossession. And I'm going to give a couple of quick examples from my research and then turn to, because I think the critique is as much about like information that we download about a history as about the form in which we express it, a little bit of reading. Okay, so who here has heard of the fair trade chain 10,000 Villages? All right, because yeah, who hasn't read my book? Okay. So this is one of the first fair trade retailers in the United States and North America. Anyone know who founded it? Who has not read Capitalist Humanitarianism? Mennonites. It was founded by Mennonite churchwomen stationed in occupied Puerto Rico and occupied Palestine following World War II. In the post-1967 war in Jordan, and then which became the West Bank, church workers, women, employed displaced Palestinians living in refugee camps, people who had lost everything, women who had lost everything, including their spouses, their sons, their kids, their homes. They looked at this and they thought, wow, what privation. This is a humanitarian crisis. How can we help? And very sincerely, I think very driven by a desire to help, they said, we have a solution. We are going to employ them on a piecework basis to make textile crafts that we can then sell to help them earn a living. They sold them to their fellow church folks back home in Pennsylvania and in Canada. They also made it big time and moved from an organization called the Needlework Project to scaling up to self-help crafts and finally to 10,000 villages in the 1990s because of the income base created by the IDF soldiers who wanted to buy Palestinian crafts to decorate their homes. I think this dramatizes the contradiction between humanitarian capitalism, perhaps which starts in a sincere desire to assist, and the ongoingness of colonialism. What happens when your better future, your humanitarian recovery is contingent on the very force that pushed you out of your home? Okay, that's one example. I can talk for many, many hours about any of these examples, but I want to sort of buzz through them so we have time to discuss. So microfinance. Microcredit is a practice that really took off in the 1990s, but was started in the 1970s of dispensing small loans to very poor people who otherwise would not have access to traditional banking. Sometimes these populations are referred to as the unbanked, and historically there's been a pretty intense focus on women as having been left out of the financial marketplace. And in the 1990s, especially under the Clinton administration, microcredit became a really a much more sort of embraced practice of international aid and USAID because it was seen as a way of giving a hand up, not a hand out, helping people help themselves, and importantly, it made humanitarian aid profitable because microfinance produces profit off of interest, or at least it quote unquote breaks even. Some of the very first support for microcredit came from leftist, communist, socialist Christians who were radicalized in the Central America Solidarity movement in the 1980s and the sanctuary movements. So trying to keep Reagan's dirty wars out of Central America and help people who were getting mass murdered for their attempts at land reform. These Solidarity Movement Christians believed that microcredit could help Central American peasant farmers stand up against the financial austerity and free trade policies ripping through the region in the late 80s and early 90s after decades of dictatorship and civil war. But of course, it can be very difficult to separate, quote, access to credit from assimilation into global debt markets. The programs that target women in the global south that began as like literally using the language of solidarity now charge 40 to 70% APR on microloans. These are very high interest loans. And and the fact that they're small, often it'll say, oh, no, it's just 4%. It's 4% compounded monthly. So one of the questions is, how does a solidarity organization, this is the religious studies conversion, turn into an organization talking about solidarity lending? This is an example of the left taking on some of the tools of finance. What else could we dream of? What else could we want instead? Okay, and then I'll give a third I know these are really fast examples. the third example comes from my ethnographic fieldwork. So in addition to doing historical work on the history of sort of the early fair trade and microcredit organizations that sort of established this as a baseline, out of these left Christian, like genuinely trying to create an alternative to global neoliberal exploitation markets, turned into something else. I also did field work with contemporary kinds of investors and financiers who were trying to do well by doing good, or do good by doing well, the triple bottom line. One of the places where some of these folks gather is at an organization, or as a conference called SOCAP, which stands for Social Capital, no reference to Bourdieu. In October 2017, which was right after the first Donald Trump election, I went to a conference of SOCAP. Hedge fund managers and CEOs took the stage and called for resistance to a kind of protectionist, nationalist, Christian nationalist capitalism via good capitalism, giving back. They decried Christian ethno-nationalism in favor of global trade. One, wearing a black resist shirt that was popular in that decade, or the end of the decade, chronicled the sins, his words, of capitalist industry before saying that he had recently taken a year-long sabbatical to, quote, read the texts of the world's great religions, which had taught him that it was time to, quote, build a church of the new capital. And he was relying on Christian liberation theology for this. Okay, there is so much we could say about these examples. There's the gendering of these programs as by and for women. Or just concerning the nuclear family as a base of both reproduction and production. There's the question of what my business school interlocutors might call mission drift. How was it that commitments of these folks, all of whom had explicit critiques of capitalism, who were aiming for models of living based on socialist democracy and mutual aid, how did they end up like going in this direction? We could debate how Christian theological frames come into this work or are transformed in later iterations of capitalist reform. I'm talking less about this, but part of this is a history of Christianity. Happy to address any of that in the question and answer. What I would submit to you is that these folks' affiliation with like traditionally religious organizations is not the most interesting thing about them for a Kirk lecture in religious studies. More compelling to me is how you can see them fumbling towards a set of vocabularies and narrative arcs and motifs and images and attachments that create the coordinates for a more contemporary expression of capitalist humanitarian consciousness, reform, and perhaps cruel optimism. Throughout my research, I've noticed a pattern in how capitalist humanitarians, including fair traders, micro bankers, or people just like everyday folks just interested in being less unethical under the constraints in which we live. How we, the language we use, I've noticed a pattern in the language we use and how we come to our projects and to our practices. The litany is anchored in a kind of historical recognition and exposure. I realize through study and reflection that the system I'm in is rooted in histories of racist, patriarchal, and colonial violence. We come to a kind of consciousness of our privilege. As there's a famous fair trade cartoon that says, "There's blood in my coffee." Connected to this historical consciousness of how we got to where we are is a confession of complicity. I realize that the things that are making possible my good life are premised on violence, a kind of moral debt to someone who is far worse off. And then perhaps this is followed by a commitment to doing something differently within the system itself. What if my commodity attachments could express solidarity with somebody? What if the workplace could promote networks of care and friendship instead of simply exploitation? What if a corporation or university built on slavery and colonialism could rededicate its profits or its work to helping oppressed people? What if there were good billionaires, good surveillance, good empire? I think about Theodore Adorno, who says, even the most honorable reformer who recommends renewal in the threadbare language reinforces the existing order he seeks to break. False clarity is another name for myth. We cannot afford to be lulled into the myth of capitalist humanitarianism. Part of the work of writing, I think, and part of what I tried to do in the book is bring out the conflicts underlying the capitalist humanitarian false clarity or smoothness, to try to spike the contradictions and even enact them in the text itself, rather than glossing over the latent contradictions of production. I want to read now a passage of my book where some of the contradictions that were getting smoothed over felt especially apparent to me, and especially problematic in terms of how to articulate them. This is where the title of the talk comes from. And it's taken from one of my very first field research sort of long-term stays in Guatemala, where microfinance institutions have tended to sort of set up shop, often as a first line before they go into other places. And often this is framed as a sort of site, as a way of recovering from a multiple decades-long civil war and genocide of indigenous people in Guatemala. And so this is kind of recovery. This particular MFI, microfinance institution, which is called in my book under the pseudonym Capital for Change, did a practice called, which they called a social action adventure tour, where they would take gringos from the global north into the sites where they were doing microfinance work to try to expose them and raise awareness of the positive impact of microfinance. And as part of my ethnography, I was on one of these tours. So the part that I'm going to read is from around day 4 of the trip. We were riding around in a van and visiting different folks who had received micro loans from this particular bank. And all day long, the tour guides, who were the local bankers that were getting money from this US bigger bank, had been building up, like, this guy that we're gonna go to see at the end of the day is the crown jewel of why we do this work. It was like the climax of the whole trip. And the reason I'm reading this is because I think the voice, like the narrator, has a voice that is maybe a little different from my voice now, and I think it's interesting to bring out the dissonances of how we change in our own consciousness. And I also think the narrative, the narrative is part of the argument. Okay. The final stop on the day's social action adventure tour was a footwear factory. Our banker guides regaled us with the backstory on an hour-long journey through elevated and bumpy terrain. The owner of the enterprise had launched it as a solo startup with a $150 US loan, and 4 years later had grown it into a shoe manufacturing business with 40 employees. Unlike other micro enterprises, which were typically run out of their founders' homes, this one had acquired commercial property near the center of town. One side of the street ran along a mountain's razor edge. On the other side, a few children milled outside of a primary school. We pulled to the side, unloaded, and approached the door of the unmarked 2-story building and filed into a dim downstairs cluttered with furniture and tables. A staircase, which was more like a ladder jutting out from a hole in the ceiling, descended into the middle of the room. Beneath those stairs, a woman hunched over a Bunsen burner. We passed her on our way to the steps, which led to a brighter room, where about 20 people worked on a haphazard assembly line. Fabrics, shoe molds, and various cutting and measuring tools had spilled from crisscross tables onto a floor so cluttered that only about half of it was really visible. I calibrated every step to avoid tripping, not least near the table with more open flames. Torn out pages from an old swimsuit magazine decorated a segment of the wall. Stressed? It asked. Masturbate. It will relax you. Less than a minute in, my surroundings were blurry. Were the glue fumes affecting my balance? Why were there no windows in here? I began a countdown for how long I could hold my breath, and only then did I register the youth of the workers themselves. They can go to school in the morning and then come to work here to earn money, the founder explained over the noise. Their families needed the income, so they came here to paste together those shoe parts, melt down globs of plastic, sew canvas, and use their small fingers to thread small laces through small holes. They also showed up to talk and laugh with their friends, it seemed. The sounds of their chatter clanged off the concrete walls. 2 older men circled the room in apparent supervision of their production, directing workers back to their tasks with a spoken reprimand or a physical touch. Our group fanned out to the extent that we could. The board member with us snapped photos. At no point did we really talk to the workers except in instances when certain tourists half requested a person consent for a photo, or sometimes just took it anyway. They would nod or giggle or make eye contact and return to whatever they had been doing. I loitered by the exit and inhaled through my t-shirt. If I was heaving for breath, how were these workers faring? How are they working? And how would one even begin to describe this scene without sensationalizing it? Our leaders had prepared us to encounter a prize microenterprise developed by a guy who had started fixing shoes as a side hustle out of his house and then grown it into the biggest employer in town. They had brought us to a sweatshop. Back in the van, my tour mates buzzed. "He's employing the youth of the community," the board member said, scrolling through her trove of digital photos. "What a great opportunity for them," said a longtime donor. I swallowed hard, trying not to unleash a tirade, and interjected with all of the diplomacy that I could muster. They looked pretty young. Did anyone have concerns about the air quality in there? Somebody said it was messy and stuffy, but it seemed fine otherwise. So I showed her the photo I'd taken of the masturbation quip. At the time, I was confident that it would prove something about the bad working conditions. My neighbor, the adult daughter of the big donor, raised her eyebrows and agreed the display was weird. But the director of Capital for Change interrupted before any discussion could get traction. She told us that the factory was the best option these kids had, not least because they were building skills and a record of work that would help them land more lucrative jobs in the future. Not least because, it was like parallel universes. I saw sweatshop labor. They saw empowerment. And then it happened again. 1 year after that trip to the shoe factory, outside a cafe on a block of pastel-colored storefronts in Antigua, I absorbed the testimony of a self-avowed impact investor. He had left behind his job at a Wall Street brokerage firm and moved here to build a venture capital fund for Latin American startups. One by one, he had ticked off his current investments until he arrived at his most recent partnerships. We just made a seed investment in a socially responsible maquilladora. At first, I thought I had misheard. But then he went on. "I know," he exclaimed, jocular. How can a maquilla be socially responsible?" He described his encounter with the founder of it. He just told me about the radical improvements she had made over most sweatshops. The working conditions were healthy and humane. For example, there were windows and natural light. There was ventilation. Workers had access to a company store stocked with everyday necessities, and they could purchase those things on credit. Best of all, the business sponsored a youth employment program in which unemployed minors were shepherded into open jobs. When my raised eyebrows betrayed an unspoken comeback that company store and child labor were generally not indicators of ethical business practice, he assured me that the store priced the company store commodities fairly. Moreover, he continued, the factory staffed only young people without better options. The founder had headquartered her business, this was a woman-owned business, in a severely underdeveloped area of Honduras with these kids in mind. These kids are not kids in school, he clarified. These are kids on the street sniffing glue. Now they have a place to go. The figure of the laboring child has played a recurring role in debates over the best approach to economic regulation and social provision. Gilded-era progressives made soot-faced waifs on assembly lines into mascots of campaigns for workplace safety. Cold War propaganda vested U.S. national identity and moral exceptionalism in the private nuclear family whose children went to school, unlike those Soviet kids in labor camps, and returned home to cookies baked by their own mothers, unlike Moscow's rationed gruel. A distorted echo of those figures carried over into 1990s high tides of anti-NAFTA activism, from workshops at the World Social Forum to students against sweatshop chapters on campuses. Left organizers demanded that consumers confront the glassy-eyed, dirt-faced child laborers suffering for the sake of the global North's cheap luxuries. I can't forget when I was in middle school and a social studies teacher dedicated a day to studying the child labor scandal at Nike. We filled out a reading comprehension worksheet about a journalist who had paid $50 for his sneakers to be embroidered with a customized tag, a sort of early customize your sneakers. He filled out the standard order form with the select phrase for his sneakers, sweatshop. But Nike refused to fill the request. It was inappropriate slang, a spokesperson for the company claimed. Over a decade after that happened, or after I read it, the director of Capital for Change used this same term to reprimand me for voicing concern about labor conditions at that shoe factory in the van. What you said was inappropriate, she admonished behind a closed door. There are donors on this trip who really care about women's empowerment. Do not make them question our commitments to that. At some point, the criticism of child labor had become more offensive than actual child labor. When I think back on that passage now and like the voice of the person who wrote it, I wish I had spent more time wondering about how my vanmates were seeing. I think they might have been thinking about bodies in detention centers, or dead in the desert, or in worse sweatshops. I think they probably were looking backwards at what could have been and thinking, oh, wow, this is so much better. They were seeing this as harm reduction. I am still not with them or those compromises. I think the looking backward, the saying, look at this recovery over what happened. Microfinance is better than genocide, is a trap. Another version of this book might have left the shoe factory and looked for powerful displays of resistance. I could have lifted up the grassroots organizers and popular uprisings that have pushed back and continue to do so. I didn't do that here, partly because that book exists and has been written, and it also seemed like a form of outing people. The anthropologist Julia Eliachar talks about NGO development as partly about identifying mutual aid networks of poor people and absorbing them into normative systems and financializing them. The question to me in writing this was about how to articulate this violence and build lacuna for something else without conveying where the saboteurs are. And not to suppose that in my role that was mine to know, but instead to convey that struggle is ongoing and contextual, and to write a book that, if it's read, will tune the ears of readers to those places and to those contradictions, which of course are constantly evolving and changing. We can point to those contradictions and make them. I wrote this book in a space of contradiction myself, where the stakes of what I am describing became real in a way that I could not necessarily have predicted when I started out. I did the research that went into this book and was about to start the writing process, so like dissertation research, then you start writing, when two disruptions, both related to the blows of capitalism in the most intimate forms of life, both connected to techno-finance, university austerity, and the election of authoritarians, changed the stakes and made them embodied in a way that I thought I knew, but then I didn't. The first context was that graduate students at Yale had were in the process of an enormous fight to have our union recognized by the school. we were doing this at the beginning of the first Trump administration, and we began a hunger strike. It was on my 4th day on the hunger strike, after a couple of arrests and civil disobedience actions, that my brother Mark, who was at the time working as a call center representative in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, had begun to experience psychosis related to the abusive dynamics of his workplace, which had billed itself as a socially responsible business making accessible hearing technologies for the deaf. Things had gotten quite bad, and he was starting to attribute meaning to words that were not in consensus reality. And it was on my 4th day of hunger striking that Mark died by suicide, too manic and desperate, and without health care to go on another day. My research began somewhere else, but my writing of this book began here. And I realized that capitalist humanitarianism as a project isn't something that goes on somewhere else. It's in our bodies and minds. It's the cop in our head, the thing that gets so normalized that we can impose it on others in the most intimate ways. And it showed up in grief. So another part of my book is these interludes that weave together the ethnography and the history with the experience of grieving and organizing at the same time. These pieces are paired with they're almost like photographic negatives of the stories. And I'm going to read you a very short one and then wrap up for questions. This is about my mother, who I love. It's almost Mother's Day. And you're allowed to laugh in this part, even though it's heavy. Okay, so I'm just telling you now. And I lost my place. Here it is. Where is it? Oh, no. Okay, ready. I started to think about, if we think about the heaviness of holding violence or loss, like the experience of like, oh, wow, like my life is dependent on all of this violence. Like that is a kind of grief. And I think what capitalist humanitarianism, in trying to manage the dissonance of that, of maybe living under fascism, is a kind of cheap form of repair. And that happens in big ways and it happens in intimate ways, whether it's a microcredit firm saying, oh, this is better than genocide, or what I'm about to describe. I know I'm not supposed to judge the grieving for their processes. Everyone has their own experience of loss. That's what the loveliest of humans, the ones who baked us casseroles and who remember Mark's anniversary year after year, always say. But I do fault people for how they grieve, and I think you should too. If not for the feelings themselves, but for how the causes and consequences of those feelings tend to get a political pass, how they insulate lived experience from critique, and underwrite dubious projects of recovery. I inherit my standards from my mother, and this is a compliment to her. After Mark died, she announced a race for what we called the Consolation Prize. It involved ranking the most gratuitously bad attempts at comforting us. The third place award, given in part on the basis of its repetition, went to the colleague who on a near daily basis harangued her at work. You can't walk around sad forever. You have to reclaim your joy. Oh, Jesus is right. The second place prize was clinched by the man who approached my mom at a meeting of Presbyterian clergy, rested his hands on her shoulders, and said, Mark lived exactly the perfect amount of days. Not a day longer or shorter than he should have. He died at precisely the right time. I want you to believe that. The grand prize went to the person who, after he overheard my mom saying something about her boy being at peace, felt moved to inform her that she, a minister, should know better. It was possible, after all, that Jesus had remanded her child to hell. Whatever the Lord's judgment, we trust in his righteousness, he boomed, patting her back. The Lord is always righteous. The Lord's judgment has nothing on my judgment. Neither does my mother's. I am making an inventory of all of the worst ways to express grief. Where do you even start? There was Achilles, who responded to the death of his boyfriend by slaughtering thousands of people on the battlefield, then revenge murdering the perpetrator and dragging his corpse around Troy on the back of a chariot. There was God, whose grief at the scale of sin prompted him to commit genocide on the planet except for Noah and some cherry-picked companions. There are the less mythical examples. I'd nominate anyone who ever cited the death of John McCain or Ronald Reagan or any other war criminal statesman to silence popular dissent or valorize civility. I'd dedicate a whole category to the generational traumas used to justify military occupation, apartheid, and racist state building. I'd file it next to the bracket that tracks the mass commodification of loss. Breast cancer ribbons and the tyrannical optimism they inflict on the sick. Designer shirts emblazoned with the latest victim of police murder. Rainforest-certified products by companies that dump wildlife-murdering carbon into the air. Any grief memoir that effaces its political context. Any grief memoir that is the preface to an advice manual for corporate executives. Any grief memoir that ends in a nationalist credo. Any grief memoir that derives closure from new babies. Any and all grief that imposes normativity, false closure, false clarity on the most endangered of the dead. The queer, the mad, the disconsolate, the extreme, the uncompromising, or the lost. Here is my most direct answer to the "why are we talking about capitalist humanitarianism now" question. Capitalist humanitarianism and its false closures lays ideological and effective groundwork for fascist movements. It does so by imposing and normalizing a system that views life primarily through a lens of production and abstract exchange. It does so by recruiting people into a promise that capitalism provides mutual benefit, a promise that rarely, if ever, delivers. It does so by vesting our politics in a very narrowed terrain of conspicuous transaction, now presented as a gesture of positive solidarity, often at the expense of other kinds of more expansive political organizing and imagination, which we still have access to. Simultaneously, as states divest from public welfare, capitalist humanitarianism outsources that work to private foundations that are by definition unaccountable to public oversight or process. Do some philanthropists and NGOs have good intentions? Do they do important work? No doubt. It still is not democracy. All of this, the contraction of political worlds, the privatization of social welfare, the quantification of life, reproduces the structural conditions through which fascism leverages its constituencies and builds them. The threat and arrival of fascism, and especially I think the way that that coincides with how those of us located within ostensibly liberal institutions like universities are recruited into compliance is a heavy, heavy thing. The good news, I would say, is that we can see these contradictions. The bad news is that awareness of contradictions alone is not a politics, and it is easily short-circuited into anti-politics, and that is what capitalist humanitarianism teaches us. The good news is that the incorporative project of empire, as it marches on, as more is lost, is incomplete. The good news is that despair and commitment and negativity and steadfast will to transform the brutal order of things can coexist, and they are inseparable. Thank you.
I think we have questions that might come in online.
Should we take a second to turn and chat with each other?
Sure, if you want. If you want to give everyone a minute.
I like everyone to have a minute and chat with your neighbor, and then we come back.
Yeah, 1 minute actually, though.
1 minute.
Sorry.
Okay, great.
Okay, everybody, we're going to get back together. We really had to give you only 1 minute because we have 14 minutes for questions, maybe 19. But I want to ask everyone to give one more round of applause for my very dear friend and colleague and collaborator and accomplice, Lucia Halteser. I'd like to welcome questions. We are going to try to do alternating between myself and my colleague Christy Cobb, who's looking at the online attendees. So I'd like to invite somebody to jump in. And if you'd like to ask a question, comment, I'd be excited to do that. Please, and then over here. Yes, please. Right there. And then, yeah, wait for the mic, please.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for the very insightful and very powerful presentation and talk. I feel very inspired now to read the book. So my background is in feminist and queer studies, and in my dissertation, I'm looking at marginalized female devotional cultures. So I was really drawn towards the idea of empowerment and the way you, like you mentioned how, those so-called humanitarian capitalists, they bank on the discourse of empowerment. So I was wondering, during your research and your initial fieldwork, did you come across this contradiction where on the one hand, yes, there is definitely oppression, and yet how do we critique empowerment while also not dismissing the voice of people who might see that as an empowering experience? Or basically, did you also talk to interlocutors and women and children who might have their own critiques of empowerment, right? So I was just curious to hear your thoughts.
Okay. Yes. Deepa was just reminding me of a part of my book that I had forgotten, which I will tell you about.
I'm not a stalker, just so you know.
No, that's good. Yes. Many of the microfinance firms that I was shadowing and engaging with, empowerment was one of their key branding things. And empowerment was, it was very enclosed notion of empowerment, which was empowerment was becoming legible to global finance capital and getting a credit score, which could then be the basis for pretty high interest, very high interest. One of the ethnographic scenes that I actually thought about reading from today, but didn't, was I was shadowing this guy who is a credit officer for a different microbank, and before developing a relationship with specific communities, these banks come into them and sort of survey the groundwork and do surveys. And we were under orders from the home base, US based organization to do these particular surveys from something called the PPI, the Pathways Out of Poverty survey, which was just a sort of a series of questions on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, yes and no. Do you have a refrigerator? Do you have a horse or a cow? It was to score poverty. But we were also supposed to be translating sort of testimonials that could then be repackaged as bootstrapping narratives for the website. And there's a lot to say about this, but a lot of the women we were talking to did not read and write, and so they would sign they would get these forms that were consent forms that were not well explained to them about can we use your image for our website. And there was somebody who was the youngest person in this weaving cooperative. She was 16. And she didn't understand what a website was. She's like, what's a website? This guy mansplains her, well, you need to know what a website is, because if you're going to do blah, 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 and if you're going to reach your dreams and go to college. And she was like, I just want to make enough food to support or make money to support my siblings. And he asked her to sign a consent form. And she sat there frozen and was and eventually silent, and then got up and was like, I can't do it, and walked away. And that is this moment, another version of the book could have followed her and been why did you do that, and blah, blah, blah. But again, not mine to know, right? I was on the side of the table with the bank. The guy I was with gets up and starts ripping up her consent form and throws it at her, the pieces in the air, and screaming, fine, we won't take a picture of you with the loom. We won't go to your house, we won't. And just this moment of violence that she was just I'm out. And I think that refusal, and then hopefully an ethnographic refusal to stalk her, and try to make that legible is like the most distilled version of an empowerment outside of the frame of the bank. Thank you for that tip to tell that story, Diva.
Sorry.
I know.
I swear I'm not a stalker. But we don't have a question yet online, so I wanted to invite Asmir if you'd like to ask a question. Can you give? Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you so much. My background is economics and political science, political economy, and I'm from Bangladesh, which is very much
Muhammad
related
Yunus.
to the birthplace of microcredit revolution in the whole world. So my question is, like, how did you see, like, I obviously haven't read your book yet, like, how did you see the role of the experts, especially the economists, in popularizing, in driving these kind of policies? Because in my experience, I have seen economists in Bangladesh, at one point, everybody talking in favor of microcredit, talking in favor of open trade policies, make people work as much as you can. Then when there's like some Rana Plaza collapse, some other international disasters happening, then everybody switching their tones. No, we shouldn't do that. Like, how did you see these experts changing their views over time?
Yeah.
Same experts.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, I think this is something that somebody needs to do a larger, like, longer project of. I didn't like track economists over time in the same way, but one thing that so a couple of things come to mind. One is that I took a lot of classes at the Yale School of Management while I was as like kind of field work, and read a lot of like econ books that were boosting. Especially microfinance, but also different kinds of, there's this book called The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid by this guy named C.K. Prahalad, which makes this economic argument that, corporations have excluded the poor, the poorest people in the world at the base of the economic pyramid, the BOP, they just refer to them as the BOP, who make $1 a day. There are billions of people. If there are billions of people who make $1 a day, that's $1 billion a day. And why haven't global corporations like captured this market yet? And theorizing, which I'm curious about how this has landed now. I mean, there were lots of critiques of him as well at the time, but saying like, oh, we need to sell like travel-sized toothpaste and shampoo and soap and flour to people who are poor because they can't make big investments like, rich people can go to Costco and get like bulk because they have enough capital to give up front. But like, let's sell them as a form of empowerment, this like hot, like single-use commodities, and narrating this as empowerment. Now that's a flashing moment that like then gets critiqued by people who are like, this is like ecologically disastrous. And what microfinance needs to do is give people enough working capital up front that they can invest in bulk items. And so I saw it like partly in arguments about how to quote unquote include, which is a recurring kind of language, financial inclusion in the global market, but people debating out what that looks like. Does it involve selling people things? Does it involve debt? Does it involve medical debt? So that's one area that I would look at, but I would be very curious to hear more from folks who are in the econ world about how like y'all have seen it, because I'm nowhere near as deep as you would be. Thank you. Is there an online question?
There's two.
Whoa.
The first one is, any thoughts on solutions or better ways to address this issue?
Wow. I mean, I think the politics, so I'm going to give a general answer, which is that part of the lie that is forwarded by these capitalist humanitarian projects is that you fight fascism by participating more, or you fight capitalism by participating more, as opposed to cutting it off. Refusal, removing your boycott, divest. I sailed over a slide, but I think BDS movements, strikes, direct action interventions are are key, and they don't feel as good because they don't like satisfy this sort of consumer urge for like immediate satisfaction and desire fulfillment. And they're much harder, and they involve so much more conflict. But yeah, that would be that slide is my answer to that question.
Should I go to the second?
Yeah.
You mentioned the high interest rates. How are the borrowers able to manage repaying the loans? Does the debt put them in a worse situation?
Yes. Now, there are always like, sort of bootstrappy success stories, but there have been, there are amazing books that are like specifically like ethnographies with communities that have like done, like with the people who are the borrowers. Rebecca Bartel's book, Card Carrying Christians, is about microfinance and debt in these evangelical and Pentecostal Christian organizations in Colombia, which are sort of pitching finance as a post-Civil War like recovery thing. She's so brilliant. People get into more debt, and often it's like multiple borrowing, right? So you take one microloan off to pay another one, and how do people pay it back? Because when it's like 4% every month, and the credit officer is visiting your house every week, or like to collect on the interest, it sort of prevents a kind of savings from happening. So that I'm looking at you as if you're the one I'm looking at the computer. So one of the mechanisms is something called solidarity lending, which is quite sinister, in my opinion, where it's group lending. So you get groups of like 10 people together, and all like 10 of us are going to get a $100 loan, and everybody gets $10 each. And if you don't pay back your loan, I am your collateral, and I have the choice of either going into your house and like taking your cooking pot as collateral, or I have to pay back what you don't pay back. And so there's when in the absence of credit scores, one of the things that banks will use to evaluate if somebody is eligible for a microloan, and there's all kinds of debate, like how do you do this the best? This is another one of the economic, like how do you know if someone's creditworthy if they don't have a financial history? And one of the questions that they'll ask is, one, do they have a trade? Like, do they have a way to make business, make income, a talent? Two, do they have peer support networks? They will sometimes go and like survey people in the community and say, like, do you know this person? Are they trustworthy? Do they have friends? The idea is that, like, are there people who would enforce accountability to the bank? And the third is, do they have hope for the future? Are they forward thinking such that they believe that they can lift themselves out of poverty? Because that kind of guarantees an ongoing sort of investment and striving, which becomes profitable, which is another reason why I think divestment, boycott, etc., are good answers.
Do we have another
One.
piece? Robert and then Lynn, but we're going to do Robert online, then Lynn.
What if we did them all in a row? Do you want to do that?
That's
Yeah.
fine.
And then we have more time. Yeah. Okay, great.
And then we'll have to help us out after that.
Hi, thanks so much that was a wonderful talk. We all have a lot of reading to do, I think, looking around the room. Okay, very, very quickly. The 40 kids working in the shoe factory are wage laborers, right? Okay. I just wanted to be...
Yeah.
I was sure that was true, but I just wanted to be absolutely sure. Okay. Oh, sorry. The other thing was, that one sentence, this is the best option these kids have, is absolute. I mean, that is so chilling, first of all, because we are going to decide that, and we are going to decide what happens to them. Mm-hmm. And, this demonstrates again that every time capitalism develops somewhere else, we have to go through primitive accumulation.
Yes.
One other thing, the phrase "good billionaire" does have a meaning. A good billionaire is a billionaire who's really good at being a billionaire.
Oh, are we doing okay, we're going to do it consecutively.
Okay. Would it be apt to describe these economic schemes of liberation, in quotes, as comparable to extracted mission labor, rationalized in part of as rescuing people from, quote, idleness?
That's smart. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, just yes.
Oh, well, I'll say more about it in a minute. Let's do the third question, then I'll see if I can bring it all together.
Okay.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. And hi, I'm back here. So I was thinking about religious studies and thinking particularly about the issue of humanitarianism and its roots in relation to, you've been talking about in relation to capitalism, which of course is related to colonial, Western imposition and empire building. And I guess I'm curious about other religious epistemologies and whether there are places where there may be more likely forms of resistance, maybe in indigenous communities, for example, or other places that you could talk about where there has been some pushback to the colonialist approach to capitalism that still is sort of articulated through an idea of the human or, human-centered beliefs.
Okay, thank you for all of that. So I'm just going to go in order. All right, so thank you, Robert, for that question. Let me go back to the shoes. So something that was pointed out to me, and I'm going to forget his last name, a graduate student at U Toronto named Edgar, who's doing an amazing ethnography of kids who live on the streets in Honduras, which is where this socially responsible sweatshop that guy had invested was, pointed out to me when I gave a talk at Toronto, is that those, if you see up those yellow buckets of glue that are in the shoe factory that I went to at the sort of top of the page, those are the same, that's the glue that the kids on the street sniff to get, the kids sniffing glue on the street that guy, the investor referred to. So it's like, where are you inhaling these fumes? And so no, it's not the best option. Those are not the only two options. They might be the only two options that are legible in the getting to the second question, this sort of mission frame of saving people from idleness, or I think even more so, like making them legible or extractable within this kind of global neoliberal frame, which does I would place it within a kind of longer Christian history. It's not the only articulation of Christianity, but it is one outgrowth, whether or not it speaks the name of a sort of Christian global mission. So yeah, I mean, it's not an accident that many, and I didn't know this when I started out, but that many of the folks who laid the foundations for our contemporary illusion that the ground of politics is in these sort of conspicuous transactions and investments are coming out of Christian churches, and not the Christian. I mean, a lot of the history of capitalism, historiography of capitalism, has focused on the Christian right? The evangelical fundamentalist family that founds Walmart, or the Hobby Lobby folks, like conservative Christian evangelicals. This is the Christian left, and they are trying to do the very alternative epistemology that you are raising, being in but not of the world, having alternative markets that aren't as exploitative. And one way of I mean, I think there's something a little rotten in it from the beginning, because it is aiming towards a kind of consumptive, reproductive, like assimilationist project. And I think there are strains where people are trying to resist, and it's capturable, right? So these are amalgamations and formations that are not, I'm not like trying to trace the kernel of the same Christianity, right? This is a kind of like dialectical process. So that's one. The other thing, I mean, I'm going to punt a little bit, because I'm a scholar, like my training is in the history of Christianity, as well as a sort of like capitalist Marxian projects. And so I imagine there are many other people in this room who could answer that question better than I could. What I would say is, one of the things I talk about in my classes that I teach on capitalism and religion are a lot of times your theory, your critique of capitalism or endorsement of capitalism begins with a certain kind of articulation of what it means to be a human. Does it mean to be an individual who is propertied and autonomous with interiority? And Marx would come out of a tradition and say, no, like I want to talk about the species being, which is intersubjective and creative and not an individual who's a property owning subject. And so you could say that is a belief, like I can be in this world, but I can believe something else. Like that basic contradiction, somebody like Herbert Marcuse would say, that comes from Protestantism, the interior self with beliefs that can be different from what's outside. And it is such a prevention, I mean, it has been globalized, but it is such a provincial notion of the human subject. So like maybe my answer is like, yeah, I would look literally anywhere else, but also note how, but that's a really, that sounds easy and flip, but it's so hard because of what colonialism has done. So if you take a world religions class, you realize that like how religion gets defined in sort of normative discourses as belief. I believe this, whether I'm a Jew or a Muslim or a Marxist or whatever. Like a capitalist, a Unitarian, a Buddhist, like it's about belief. Well, that's a Protestant imputation. It doesn't mean that it doesn't materialize or become something that people identify with. And so it's much messier. But yeah, you can read all of these texts like against themselves even. I think that's even true in this sort of like history of Christianity. Yeah. So that's my like dodge of your question, but hopefully you said something smart. Okay, great.
But I will say that in her book, she actually does talk about these conflicts. You don't remember maybe, but like your indigenous conflicts and the ways in which people have resisted. I mean, that's something that I think does come out, but it's not your focus. Right, it's not your focus either. But I thank you all for coming out. I hate to cut this conversation off, but you're welcome to corner Lucia before I drag her to dinner. I just really appreciate everyone coming out. I wanted this lecture here because I wanted people to see that talking about democracy and capitalism in these moments is actually religious studies. So please know that, and thank you all for being here, and thank you all for giving such a warm welcome to Lucia Halteser. I really appreciate it. If we can give her one last round of applause.